I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. All through February, the New York Times has been publishing obituaries of non-white people who, during the paper's long history, were overlooked. We'll talk with Amy Padnani a little later about this important project. But first, with the fight for new revenues, a never-ending concern of city government, we now know that Amazon's new headquarters may not contribute to or take away from, depending on your point of view, the city's coffers. At the same time, the MTA is struggling for new funding streams. Is congestion pricing going to be the answer? Jeff Bays of the City Hall Bureau of the New York Times will talk about both these subjects. Jeff, let's talk about Amazon first. Sure. Why were the talks with Amazon, the mayor and the governor, so secret that no one else was included? And then when everyone was presented with what looked like a done deal, the local politicians decided to walk away from it?
Well, I think the argument from the mayor and the governor was in order to get this deal done, they needed some privacy. What happened when the deal came out, no one had really been brought to the table. And people were very upset about that. They voiced their disapproval of the plan. Even politicians that had signed a letter, just a year ago, inviting Amazon to come to New York City, were upset that they were not brought into the discussions. So there were a lot of concerns about how the community would be affected by Amazon building their campus in Long Island City. And secondly, what would be the real benefits from members of the community for this massive project?
At the end of the week, we were seeing signs that the governor was trying to woo Amazon, Jeff Bezos, back into the deal. Obviously, that's a little bit up in the air, and we don't know yet whether that will happen. Was there something, and of course this is all second guessing, that the governor and the mayor could have done differently? Or are we talking about the fact that in New York, if you do anything out in the open, it becomes messy and complicated?
Yeah, I was surprised that, the mayor, for example, didn't do more retail politicking to try to win over some of the adversaries to this plan. He's the mayor of New York City. He has things that he can offer, projects and money for other things. He did that with the MTA, the congestion pricing plan. He rode the subway and talked to commuters and got out there and urged them to call their state senators. I think there might have been some underestimation on behalf of the governor and the mayor about how this project would be received. There was just fierce opposition, especially with this blue wave that has taken effect in New York and Albany and the progressive legislators that have been elected. They came out just in force against the Amazon deal.
Jeffrey, I was also surprised at the mayor's quick turnaround. He negotiated the deal with the governor. I assume the governor kind of led those negotiations. But then once it seemed to be falling apart, once the Queen's legislators seemed to be going against it, or at least demanding more from Amazon, the mayor suddenly balked himself and began denouncing Amazon instead of trying to corral the opposition.
Right. It was very interesting. It could have something to do with the mayor's recent trip to Iowa to talk to people. He hasn't ruled out running for president. He certainly has a vision that he will be a sort of progressive standard bearer in this country. He wants to take some of the ideas that he's done here, like pre-kindergarten and time off, paid time off, bring those around the country. So after the Amazon deal fell apart, he did not blame some of the people, the adversaries against it. In fact, just blamed Amazon for not being willing to cooperate, not being willing to offer more community benefits for the project, whereas Governor Cuomo went directly at the people who were against the deal, Senate Democrats and other progressive leaders, and has been doing so for the past couple of weeks, blaming them for the collapse of the deal.
One person the governor did not blame, at least not yet as far as I recall, is the mayor, which, he may not have been responsible for the collapse, but he certainly was responsible for bad-mouthing Amazon afterward. Why do you think that is? The governor said, well, he didn't even read the mayor's remarks, which sounds a little bit hard to believe.
Well, they've had this long-standing rivalry and public feud that's gotten very nasty over the last few years. And so they've come together. Amazon was the thing that they were able to come together on and put that plan out there with both of their names on it. Now you're seeing the same thing with congestion pricing and fixing the MTA. So they seem to have come to some sort of agreement in their relationship where they don't go after each other as often. The other day, the mayor was asked who controls the MTA, and he said in a very gentle, kind way that the governor does control the MTA. But if this was a few years ago, the words might have been much more choice.
That's very interesting. I mean, if there is a cooperative spirit, first of all, it's about time. And secondly, there is a lot more they can accomplish together than they can feuding with each other, since for the most part, they have the same goals and to a great extent the same problems. If the governor does pull off getting Amazon back, that would be quite a coup. Do you think the Queen's legislators would be more receptive to working out a compromise, and the unions as well?
I think Amazon would have to come to the table with an amazing amount of community benefits and changes in terms of how they deal with unions and pay and job guarantees maybe, because there was just outrage that those things were not laid out first when the plan was brought up by the governor.
Which seems awfully naive on the part of the governor and the mayor as well, frankly.
Right, you could predict that, and this is a progressive city, this is a union town. You could have predicted that those would have been the concerns that the adversaries would have brought up. And I think there was some room amongst the people who were opposing the plan that maybe they thought Amazon would come back to the table and that they could get some of these wins that they were looking for.
And also on the MTA, on congestion pricing, that was something that the mayor had been very cool to. Do we have any sense as to what brought him aboard this time? Was there anything in that deal that we have seen so far that persuaded the mayor to go along?
Well, I think first there's just the situation with the MTA. It has been degrading, and residents are just upset. The subway is the lifeblood of the city. Commerce, everything goes to the subway. The mayor said he was able to get some concessions into the plan. So, the East River bridges won't be tolled, for example. And there will be certain exceptions in there for people going to the doctor, for example. So I think it's a situation where we're at the point where you have to do something with the MTA. It's at a critical level. And, the mayor could point to those concessions as a reason that he was able to change his mind.
We're going to have a new public advocate in the city. Jumaane Williams won that race this week. Of course, as soon as he won the race, the candidates have to start circulating petitions for a primary in June to run again in November for an election for who's going to be the public advocate to fill out the rest of the term. So, this is sort of, I wouldn't say a Pyrrhic victory, but short term. What's going to be different with him as public advocate compared to Letitia James, who became Attorney General?
Well, his reputation is as a street activist. He's been arrested a number of times from protesting everything from criminal justice reforms to immigrants' rights. So he really brings this sort of activist spirit to the role. It's what he was known for. And I think going forward, there's some questions about whether the office needs to be revamped. They have a very tiny budget, around $3.5 million.
And a budget that is, not fixed at all. It's sort of on the whim of the council and the mayor.
Exactly. So they would like that budget to have some independence. In addition, I think that he has a plan to expand the office, to put, sort of deputy public advocates in every borough to kind of reach out to residents. He's certainly going to need more funding for that. And there is a charter review commission underway right now, and that is one of the things they're going to examine. So it will be interesting to see what kind of changes they make to this office, what kind of power that he will actually have.
And interesting, too, that Corey Johnson, who was sort of the acting public advocate, said that he came away persuaded that there is reason to keep this job.
Yeah, absolutely. The number of constituents calls I think he got while he was there, and he saw just the need. And he used his time in that office as acting public advocate very wisely. He's a potential mayoral candidate. He was traveling around the city doing a survey of subway and bus service, getting his name out there on an important issue. So I think there's been some calls for the office to be abolished, but a lot of other people see a very important function in this ombudsman role.
And very important politically for Corey Johnson to do that, since he is elected as a council member, not citywide, something that Melissa Mark Viverito found was a handicap when she was trying to run citywide for public advocate. One thing that surprised me a little bit was Jumaane Williams ruling out a mayoral race in 2021.
I think it's actually pretty smart politically. It was a way for him to get some of the big name supporters behind him. Some of the mayoral candidates for 2021 don't see him as a threat. The other day, Ruben Diaz in the Bronx called for other people to step out of the race so that Jumaane wouldn't have to contest it again. And certainly, it looks like that might happen. He won 33% of the vote. Lots of support in Brooklyn, his base. So it looks like he may have an easier path come November.
Yeah, I was a little surprised at how well he won. No?
Right, yeah, and I was surprised at the turnout. It was overall pretty low, 9% of the voters came out, but more than 400,000 people voted in this election, which was a lot more than I expected.
Yeah, still a little pathetic, but more than we expected indeed. Thanks to Jeffrey C. Mays of the New York Times City Hall Bureau. Coming up next, Amy Padnani talks to us about the overlooked obituaries. The New York Times has been producing obituaries since 1851. Overlooked is a new addition to the obituary section, and all through Black History Month in February, the Times has been adding prominent black men and women to its archives. I'm with Amy Padnani, obituaries editor of this section, this special project of the New York Times. Amy, how did this begin?
So this began in March of 2018. That was the launch of the initial version of the project. But really the story begins around the time I started on the obituaries desk 2 years ago. Readers were writing in to say, hey, why don't you have more women and people of color in your obituaries pages? And I wondered the same as a woman of color and as a journalist looking to introduce more diversity into our coverage. I thought, what could I do here? And so one day I came across a story about Mary Outerbridge. She was credited with introducing tennis to America in 1874. And I thought, wow, one of the biggest sports in America introduced by a woman. So on a hunch, I checked our archives to see if she got a New York Times obituary, and lo and behold, she hadn't. So I thought maybe there's something to this. I started looking at other interesting figures that have appealed to me in my research, and I saw that there were several others who didn't receive obits. So I amassed a list of a couple dozen names, went to the head of the obituaries desk and said, what if we tell their stories now? And so that's how Overlooked came about.
And Bill McDonald, the editor, was certainly receptive to that. Why didn't we give some of these people obituaries? Was it because they were women, or because they were black, or were they just overlooked for some other reason?
It's so hard to say, we still wonder that. The story kind of changes a bit for Black History Month. For these obituaries, many of these people were slaves or were just a generation removed from slavery. A lot of them didn't receive recognition in their lifetime for the things that they achieved. And so we wouldn't have heard about them. We wouldn't have heard in their lifetime about what they were doing. And so we certainly wouldn't have heard about their deaths or known how important they were. So this was sort of a little different from the rest of the project because it gave us more of a retrospective opportunity to explore their lives.
And in the beginning of Black History Month in February, we put out a special section in print on uncovered Black history and overlooked Black obituaries of both men and women. That's a special section still online, of course, at nytimes.com. Beautifully done with lots of obituaries. It is rather amazing that all of these people were overlooked. Do we have any sense as to whether this was something unique to the Times, or was it the press in general, the white press, the mainstream press, that overlooked all of these people?
That's one of the hunches, that a lot of these people didn't receive obituaries anywhere else either. Media initially was made by white men for white men. But we also wonder if there was something about that day at the Times when a person died. Maybe there was a sleepy editor in charge. Maybe it was a busy news day and there were too many other things to take care of. Or maybe that person died in obscurity. It's tough to say why they didn't receive those obits.
Well, especially when we understand how arbitrary the process can be even now. When people were complaining about that, were they complaining about the lack of women and people of color back then or today?
They were complaining about it today. And I have been working with the other obituaries editors to try and find ways to incorporate more women and people of color into our report.
So how do we do that?
It's a little tricky to find them. I think
Bill McDonald addressed that in a piece, and it was very interesting because he said back, generations ago, might have been more difficult to find because they hadn't been integrated into higher ranks in society where they might merit obituaries. Now, certainly they are, but obviously we have to be more aware of them.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that for sure. But the New York Times has historically been more focused on domestic issues, particularly New York City. One area we could explore is internationally. There are other areas of the world where women are invited to make a difference sooner. And so that's one area where we could look
Like heads of state, for one thing.
That's right. And so we've improved our outreach to some of our foreign correspondents all over the world, and they've been contributing more ideas when they hear about somebody important in their area who dies, a scholar, a musician, an artist. They tell us this person was important in the community, somebody we probably never would have heard of otherwise, but there's a whole group of people out there for whom their lives were changed by this person. So that's one area. And we also developed sort of a tool to measure our ratio of men and women month to month in obituaries that we publish. Prior to that, it was sort of a hand tally count, looking at who we had. But this allows all of us to check in at any moment to see what the percentage breakdown is for men and women and see if we need to make more of an effort to do some research and find other people.
And also we invited readers to nominate people for the overlooked category. What kind of nominations did we get? Did people respond to that?
Oh yeah, we received nearly 4,000 submissions since this went up. So you can imagine.
We forgot a lot of people.
Well, yeah, we had a lot of obits for some of those people, but others, there's some great tales that came out of there. Some of them we've done. There's Minnie Freeman. She was a Nebraska school teacher. There was this freak blizzard in 1888 in Nebraska when everybody thought it was a nice warm day. They all left their jackets at home. All of a sudden the wind blew and all the school teachers with their students were wondering what to do. The roofs were being torn off their schoolhouses. And so one teacher sent the kids home early. One of them kept the kids in overnight. But in Minnie Freeman's classroom, where there was no window and no door, she found some twine, tied it around all the school children and around herself, and led them a mile into safety in the blizzard. So she received nearly 200 marriage proposals as a result of this. She was called the Fearless Maid. And it was a tale of a time that people may not have paid a lot of attention to, but resonated with teachers today who feel they often are placed in these positions where they have to be heroes.
And often take it for granted as well.
That's right. So that actually was suggested to us by a school teacher in Nebraska who was inspired by her tale. And there were several others like that came out of the suggestions directly.
That's wonderful. How do people nominate someone for an overlooked obituary?
If they go to nytimes.com/overlooked, there's a link to a form that they can fill out there.
That's great. Are we going to continue Overlooked either individually or thematically in the months to come?
The idea is to continue it at least till the end of 2019, but really the sky is the limit, so hopefully it'll go on beyond that.
And are we going to look at themes like we would in terms of women or Black history or things like that? And is there a cutoff? Do we only do them since 1851 when the paper began publishing, or can we go back even further historically?
Technically, since the New York Times began publishing in 1851, if somebody died before then, we couldn't have overlooked them because we didn't exist. So that's one criteria. They must have died after that period. And as for other categories, I think it might be interesting to do something for Pride Month. The 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots is coming up. So we're looking at some options there. But otherwise, it's really just going to continue to include important women and men of color at this point who were left out.
Amy, since these are people that for the most part we didn't cover, or at least we didn't cover their deaths, how do we gather the information on them? How do we do what amounts to a biography of them?
Research can be really complex, and you can run into a lot of snafus in the process. One example is with Bessie B. Stringfield. She was known as the motorcycle queen of Miami. She used to ride her motorcycle in the 1930s through the Jim Crow South, and she made all these people really, happy and inspired by what she was able to accomplish. However, as our reporter found out, she lied about her upbringing, about where she was born, about who her parents were, about what her background was. And she had to uncover all of this through ordering death certificates and hunting down her nephew in a nursing home in his 80s and asking all of these questions. And she called me and said, "What do I do? This woman lied." And I said, "Well, let's write that into the story then." And that's exactly how it was published. Was this woman really wanted to be known this way, but here's the truth.
So you can't just rely on Wikipedia or anything like that.
No, and as you know, the work of a New York Times reporter it requires a lot more in-depth research than that.
And when we're trying to be more equitable and be more diverse, how do we avoid overcompensating? When we do obituaries that some people think may be an arbitrary standard, how do we make sure that we are not including people just because they are women or anything like that?
The New York Times has a really strict criteria for who rises to the level of receiving an obit, and we still maintain that criteria for sure. I think more of it is searching for those people rather than changing our standards. We still feel like if that person made news in their lifetime, chances are their death is news as well. What I think Overlooked may have taught us is that sometimes those people may not have received recognition in their lifetime, but they still deserve it in their deaths. So we just have to consider that when we think about the importance of who they influence, talk to more people, do a little more digging and research to find out how they could have changed the world or society.
Well, great. Keep up the good work. And of course, remember, you can nominate people as well. Just go to nytimes.com. Thanks to Amy Padnani. I'll have some additional thoughts on CODA next. This week, for the second time in 4 months, Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio briefly buried their hatchets in someplace more constructive than each other's back. Let's hope they learned something from their last joint venture in November. 4 months ago, after secret negotiations, they agreed on huge tax incentives to lure Amazon's satellite headquarters and 25,000 jobs to Long Island City. While far from perfect, arguably the deal was good for the city long term. It was for Amazon. And Jeff Bezos was convinced it would go through because the mayor, who was never considered an abettor of big business, seemed to share the same goals as the governor, and they were both getting along. What they all forgot is that New York remains a democracy, and democracy can be messy. In their zeal to complete a deal, they kept the details to themselves. They presented local politicians with a fait accompli. They said, take it or leave it. This time, those who felt left out decided not to take it. Even de Blasio badmouthed the deal that he himself negotiated. Amazon called their bluff and left it. Other companies might have been more willing to compromise. Amazon was big enough to bail. This week, the governor got the mayor on board for another agreement to impose fees on vehicles entering the most congested streets of Manhattan. This deal isn't perfect either. It directs the revenue to the MTA instead of exclusively to the subway system, which needs it most. Their 10-point plan just begins to address the question of accountability for service and the latest fare increase. The plan doesn't include restoration of a commuter tax, which former Speaker Sheldon Silver, in his most corrupt act, killed in a failed effort to re-elect a suburban assemblyman. Missing again when the governor and mayor announced their plan were legislative leaders and members of the MTA board. They may fear the governor, who finally admits that he's responsible for mass transit, but they seem to forget that they're legally responsible not to whomever appoints them, but to the MTA itself. Robert Moses used to say, if the ends don't justify the means, what does? He had a point, but the backlash to his means, to his unilateral bulldozer diplomacy, has left a lot of loose ends in the dust. The means were justified only if the ends were achieved. Moses also famously popularized a metaphor to describe the difficulty of getting anything done in government. You can't make an omelet, he said, without breaking eggs. A reminder to the governor and mayor as they navigate their latest agreement. Implicit in his maxim is that the egg is not supposed to wind up on your face. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.